It's a great pleasure to welcome everybody here to the Linnean Society Lunchtime Lecture. We started these lectures a few years ago and started them on a small scale, but now they've really become as important as our evening lectures. And I'm really happy that people are able to come to both of them, because sometimes people can't come in the evening. So today we're really privileged to have Dr. Ellie Devenish-Nelson and Dr. Howard Nelson, an amazing pair, to talk to us about challenges and opportunities for Caribbean endemic bird conservation. Now, I can never think about Caribbean birds without thinking about James Bond, but I expect they're going to tell us so much more about Caribbean birds. So I'll probably have to push James Bond to the back of my mind. So both Ellie and Howard work on ecology and conservation and look at this from an area of both species, but also through landscapes. And that sort of perspective is going to be really interesting when they talk to us about the challenges and opportunities for endemic bird conservation in the Caribbean. So thank you very much, and over to you, Ellie and Howard.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sandy. And thanks very much for that kind introduction. I wish we'd put a picture up of the James Bond book now, giving us an opportunity. Anyway, just thanks, and we're really thrilled to be able to give this talk today. So I'm going to start by just briefly exploring what's special about islands. So for biologists, islands have played a special part in our understanding of the living world since Darwin's time. And their remarkably high levels of biological uniqueness, or endemism, mean that their contribution to global biodiversity is disproportionate to their size. And their isolation ensures that species evolving in these places develop independently of common ancestors on continents, leading to these high levels of evolutionary unique species. And so while islands tend to host fewer absolute numbers of species than continents, more island species are endemic than on mainland areas, which gives rise to their overwhelming importance of biodiversity on islands. And the Caribbean is one of these biodiversity hotspots. Its endemic vertebrates represent 3.5% of the world's vertebrate species, and its endemic plants are 2.6% of global plant species. And all of this is while the whole region represents barely 0.5% of global landmass. It's also worth saying here that this diversity doesn't stop at wildlife. The Caribbean consists of 30 nations and territories, each with its own unique culture and heritage. So, although endemism in birds is nowhere near as high as it is for amphibians, reptiles, and plants, which are less mobile, the Caribbean, here from Trinidad and Tobago to the Bahamas, hosts just over 170 island and regionally endemic birds. Over 100 of these endemic birds are restricted to just one island, while the others are found on just a few groups of islands. And to give you some perspective, the larger islands of Jamaica, Hispaniola, Cuba, Puerto Rico have about 26 to 28 island endemics each. And depending on the taxonomy and the biogeography that you follow, there are about 2 to 5 families that are endemic to the Caribbean region. The toadies are perhaps the most iconic of these families, with 5 species that are found only in the Greater Antilles, like this Cuban toady on the top left. Stollidae is another widely recognized endemic family with just a single species, the palm chat, which is found only on Hispaniola. Now we haven't been to Hispaniola yet, so we don't have a photo of this one yet. The Spindalis family is also found mainly in the Greater Antilles. The Western Spindalis here at the bottom right, is found from the Cayman Islands up to southern Florida. At the generic level, there are about 36 genera endemic to the Caribbean. The Cuban trogon, here in the center, is one of just 2 species of Priotellus. The Zapata sparrow, which is a single species in the genus Torianus, here at the bottom left, is found only in a few locations in Cuba. And the brown trembler, here at the top right, is one of just 2 species of tremblers that are restricted to the Lesser Antilles. So hopefully you get a sense of the diversity of endemic birds and why it's exciting to visit the different islands. So as well as being of evolutionary importance, these endemic species play important roles in ecosystem functioning. So for example, hummingbirds are important pollinators, with some Caribbean plants having evolved exclusive relationships with these species. And many endemics, like the doves and the parrots, are also important seed dispersers. And these economic ecosystem functions of birds are of great importance as ecosystem services to humans. So for instance, the toadies are important predators of the coffeeberry borer beetle, which is the world's most serious coffee pest. But the value of the endemic birds goes way beyond their ecological roles. Tourism is more important to Caribbean countries than to any other region, contributing on average about 14% of GDP, but this can be over 70% on some islands. Most of this tourism is, of course, sun, sea, and sand, but ecotourism makes up nearly 5%, with, of course, much of this generated by birdwatching. So, for example, it's estimated that in the Bahamas, $39 million is spent annually by birding tourists. Yeah, it's much more than even just economic value. These economic endemic and iconic endemic birds permeate the culture throughout the Caribbean, from folklore and endemic bird festivals to inspiring carnival costumes and art. But what makes these birds special also makes them vulnerable. Today, 25% of Caribbean endemic birds are threatened with extinction. Put this in perspective, by comparison, the threat rate for birds globally is about 13%. What's more, for those endemics that we have population trend estimates for, about 60% are thought to have declining populations. So why do these endemics have such high extinction risk? Historically, islands have been centres of extinctions, as we know that island species are much more at risk of extinction than continental species. And this is largely because island species have evolved without many predators. The Caribbean has some of the highest rates of historical extinctions. For example, it's lost 55% of its original parrots, losing 14 or 15 species of parrots, parakeets, and macaws, mostly since the arrival of Columbus in the 1400s. We know that many of the islands had their own parrots and macaws that are now lost, like this Martinique Amazon on the left here, the Puerto Rican parakeet, and the Lesser Antillean macaw. And these birds were hunted to extinction for food and feathers. So what are the current threats to endemic birds? Invasive species, habitat loss, and overexploitation are the greatest threats, with climate change increasingly exacerbating all of these threats. The Caribbean is actually predicted to have the highest extinction rates of endemic species of all the 36 biodiversity hotspots due to habitat loss and climate change. These threats don't function in isolation. Species can face several of all of these threats at the same time, of course. As an example, with critically endangered Grenada dove, the national bird of Grenada, here in the middle right, is currently restricted to 2 small areas on Grenada and numbers not more than a couple of hundred birds. Invasive species and habitat loss are its main threats. And invasive species are one of the biggest causes of extinctions on islands, and in the Caribbean, the mongoose is one of the most voracious of these invasive predators. In Jamaica, it's thought to be responsible for the extinction of the Jamaican petrel. On Grenada, and this island is too large for a total eradication, mongoose predate upon both adult and fledgling Grenada doves. And this predation, which is devastating on its own, it then compounds an even bigger threat to the dove, which is the habitat loss from development for housing, for tourism, and agriculture. And the dove is found only in the lowland dry forest, which is, this is where the pressure for development is greatest because it's flat, it's close to the coast, and it tends to be perceived as habitat as having little value. One of the key areas for the dove, called Mount Hartman, was designated a protected area in 1997. But this is an example of the fragility of depending on protected areas for conserving these species. The park was degazetted in 2006 to allow for a hotel development, which then luckily fell through due to the economic crisis. And although the park has since been regazetted, there have been multiple attempts to develop this area, and it's now facing the threat of a new development again, just outside that park boundary. And the tragedy here is that even though these developments have so far fallen through, there's not been before large areas of the dry forest have been cleared. And this story is being played out across many of the landscapes of the Caribbean, and we'll come back to this story later. Another example of the impact of synergistic threats is the critically endangered Trinidad piping guan on the bottom left here, which is now restricted to a small and largely undisturbed forested peninsula on the island. It's estimated that there are only a few hundred birds left in the wild. Its initial decline was due to historically high levels of hunting. These birds used to be found in groups of up to 50 or so, but unfortunately they were attracted to smoke and the birds weren't spooked by gunshot, so they were an easy target, and you'd be lucky now to find them in a couple of them at once. There is also a lot of cultural significance attached to this bird in these areas. The meat was highly valued for food, and yeah, while there is still localized hunting, more recently they have become the focus of ecotourism. But they are also restricted due to habitat loss throughout their former lowland habitats, and this is now a bigger threat than hunting. And now there's port development starting in the Toko Peninsula where they're found. And while it's not directly in their core habitat, it brings with it the threat of increasing access and wider habitat disturbance due to this increased human activity. And then a final example here is the near-threatened Barbuda warbler, found only on the tiny 62 square miles of Barbuda. And so this means it does have a naturally small population. In 2017, the Category 5 Hurricane Irma devastated the island with a direct hit. I think many people would remember the pictures from the news. The first team of surveyors to go to the island a couple of weeks after the storm found only 8 birds. Luckily, a year and a half afterwards, a survey team found the bird to be recovering pretty well. But this illustrates just how vulnerable these small populations are to extreme weather events. And even though many island species are actually quite resilient to storms, as they have evolved with hurricanes, many species will struggle to cope with the increasing intensity and high return rates that are predicted due to climate change. Barbuda has a unique cooperative land ownership system, and since the hurricane, the government has been applying pressure to privatise this land, which would pave the way for international hotel development. So far, this hasn't happened, and the local population is largely against it, but it does raise the complexity of land ownership and the socioeconomic challenges of achieving sustainable development and biodiversity conservation. So clearly, changing land use is a major threat to endemic birds. When considering the Caribbean context, most landscapes are already greatly modified or impacted by humans in some way. Over 90% of land area in the Caribbean is human modified. It's estimated that the Caribbean hotspot has less than 30% forest cover remaining across the whole region. And of course, a unique feature of islands, their small land area, means that there's tension between conserving land for biodiversity and the reality of having working landscapes. So we know that land use change remains the biggest cause of biodiversity loss globally, but climate change has rapidly become the next biggest threat. And this is true in the Caribbean, where these threats combine to present the most significant threat to biodiversity. So the threats that we've discussed so far are what we call proximate threats, those factors that cause the immediate decline of a species. But what about the ultimate threats, those factors that are the root cause of the proximate threats? The key challenges of conserving these species in a human-dominated landscape and addressing these ultimate threats is complicated. Most countries in the Caribbean are middle and lower income countries and are challenged by a lack of knowledge, lack of capacity and resources, as well as weaknesses in legislation and enforcement. And so we'll illustrate some of these challenges using endemic birds. So our understanding of species populations affects our ability to assess the effectiveness of our conservation actions. Having baseline data like estimates of population density allows us to use this as an index to monitor the effectiveness of management or assess how a species responds to environmental change like hurricanes or habitat disturbance. The tropical species are typically less well studied than temperate species, and many are lacking this kind of fundamental baseline data. The nature and extent of our knowledge can affect how we prioritize conservation actions. And as a result, knowledge gaps have important impacts on our decision making. So one of the ways we can assess our current knowledge is to review the published literature. So how well are our Caribbean endemics studied?
Okay, thanks, Ellie. So here we show a review of the published scientific literature on Caribbean endemic birds. We found most families have much less research effort than we would expect based on the number of species within each family. A notable exception are the parrots. This reflects the large number of studies on these highly charismatic and threatened species. Of course, this doesn't mean that we should do less research on parrots, but it does provide us with an indication of where we might want to focus more efforts in the future, such as on the more evolutionarily unique species or many of the species of least concern for which we know very little, but many of which are now thought to have declining populations. We also found that there was a substantial geographic bias in research effort, which again reflects some of the research on parrots, with Puerto Rico, Dominica, and Hispaniola, all having endemic parrots, more research than we might expect. But this also reflects funding and resources. For example, Puerto Rico has US government funding, well-established universities, and robust legal conservation mandates. These all translate into a well-structured research agenda. Much less research has been conducted, for example, on Jamaican endemics. Although there are well-established universities on the island, we think this reflects a much younger and less well-developed research culture across the island. We also found that there's been no significant increase in research efforts since the 1980s, while there have been changes over time in the subjects that have been studied. Generally, there's been a decrease in studies of distribution and abundance and an increase in research on genetics and captive species, which was expected due to advances in technology and the increasing role of ex situ conservation. However, we didn't find any significant increase in studies on conservation and management of wild populations. This bias in species, countries, and subjects that get attention is in part driven by the fact that most research on Caribbean endemics is still externally driven, meaning that it is undertaken by researchers from external institutions. Of course, this is complex, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there is no participation by local researchers or that these researchers aren't Caribbean nationals. But it does reflect ongoing challenges in the region, such as the brain drain and a lack of sufficient trained researchers. What this means for our understanding of endemic birds is that this externally driven research comes with a price. For example, international researchers are influenced by the interests of funders, which often results in a mismatch with needs of the on-the-ground conservation practitioners. Of course, this example of research effort is just one indicator we have of knowledge and capacity within the region. Much of our knowledge does not end up in the published literature. It is embedded in the human capacity within the state agencies and NGOs. This brings us to another key challenge in the Caribbean, that of human capacity. Among the amateur and NGO ornithological community, there is a growing body of trained professionals, which we think can translate into filling these knowledge gaps. While it is true that capacity among the NGOs is largely increasing, this is often not reflected in many of the national agencies with the mandate to manage these species and their habitats. From this perspective, we often find capacity is one person deep, meaning that often there's a single individual that works on multiple areas of conservation. By comparison, in a more developed country such as the UK, roles undertaken by this individual would be done by a room full of people. The story of Grenada, where we've been working for many years, is representative of many islands. In their Forest and National Parks Department, there's been a slow and steady decline in personnel since we started working there. A cohort of senior trained foresters have retired. And in 2014, the government initiated a 90% attrition policy in order to pay back loans from the International Monetary Fund. This means that only one person is hired across the civil service for every 3 retirements. The lack of funds also means that junior foresters haven't received the training that was provided to their senior colleagues. And we've seen that this leads to despondency within the agency. What this means for conservation is that there's a mismatch between the coverage of protected areas and the actual capacity to manage these areas. But there is a positive side to this limited human resource. Working in multiple fields forces individuals to look beyond single issues and to take a broad interdisciplinary view of the conservation challenges that face the islands. This is a huge strength of the region's professionals, and this is reflected in the solutions that we see for many of the region's conservation problems. This lack of knowledge and human capacity reflects some of the resource and political challenges in the islands and the importance of political will to conservation. Protected areas are the crown jewels in conservation because we know that protecting whole habitats is more effective than single species or ex situ conservation approaches. However, as we've seen with Grenada, protected areas are vulnerable to degazetting and downgrading. In Trinidad and Tobago, the protected areas system has been in place unchanged since the 1960s, apart from some minor changes in the early 2000s. We've known that this system is inadequate since the 1970s. It doesn't provide the best coverage and representation to ensure resiliency of natural systems on the island. Despite 3 major attempts to revise the system, the country was unable to undertake the changes to its protected areas that would enable it to keep up with current best practices. All the attempts at revising the system were thwarted by a lack of political will, with multiple governments failing to push forward the plans due to apathy or a lack of urgency. In countries like Trinidad and Tobago, there are still many areas that could be protected. For example, we know that there are several ecosystems that are underprotected, but their protection requires buy-in by multiple stakeholders, even where the land is state-owned. After 40 years of trying, we finally made a breakthrough. As part of a large global environment facility funded project aimed at improving protected area management in the country, we wrote a new protected area systems plan. And last year, the government of Trinidad and Tobago agreed to go forward with that plan. So what were the lessons from this? We learned that timing is everything. It took 40 years because we needed not only to have the money in place for the project, but we had to have the right persons delivering the message and the right persons in the NGOs, government agencies, and wider civil society to receive the message. Finally, to share more good news, just this October, UNESCO has just announced a new biosphere reserve in Northeast Tobago, which is now the largest man-made biosphere reserve in the English-speaking Caribbean and encompasses the Main Ridge Forest Reserve, the oldest protected area in the Western Hemisphere, established in 1776. What does this new protected areas system mean for conservation of birds on the island? Through the new system, we can expect a significant increase in protection across birds in several ecosystem types, with some groups, such as water birds and dry forest birds in Tobago, like newly recognized endemic Tobago greenlet, and the high elevation species in Trinidad, like the Trinidad piping guan and Trinidad motmot, benefiting especially from the new system. We also found a key component in breaking through the logjam of protected areas designation was realism. We emphasized reducing conflict by focusing on state lands and getting consensus from stakeholders on the areas that they thought deserved protection. In several cases, this means that we could not cover some areas that were of high conservation value, such as the west coast of Trinidad, where the level of existing human disturbance, ownership patterns, and access issues made designation of these areas potentially high conflict. In these cases, we made the decision that we would not be able to include them in this round of protected areas designation. And herein lies the challenge for the Caribbean, moving from our current level of protected areas an approach that effectively conserves birds across entire landscapes. Such human landscapes are complex places where historical uses, ownership, access rights, future development plans present a challenge to the integration of conservation. This brings us to the last challenge that we wanted to highlight, the one that is central to conservation on the islands, the problem of limited geographic land space. This means that conservation in the Caribbean presents a compromise between striving for formal habitat protection and the reality of working landscapes. Now, to put this in perspective, current international targets under the Convention on Biological Diversity known as the Aichi targets, call for 17% of global terrestrial area to be protected by 2020. Actually, the Caribbean is doing pretty well, with an average of about 19% of terrestrial areas protected, although this does vary widely, and we've seen from Trinidad and Tobago that there are often gaps in protection. But amongst the international community, there are growing calls to protect even larger amounts of land when the Aichi target is renegotiated, meant to be this year but now postponed. This figure we present here highlights the challenges with increasing protected areas in the Caribbean. It's clear that in some countries, even achieving the current target of 17% is not possible using formal protected areas, given the small proportion of state lands, and noting that these state lands include all types of land use. There are calls to increase the target to 30% by 2030. But it's clear that achieving this using only state lands is unrealistic for many islands. So, how does the current level of protection translate into protecting the ranges of endemic birds? We can explore this by working out how much of a species range is covered within protected areas and comparing this to a target based on the species range size. So, for species with large ranges, it is assumed that adequate protected area coverage does not need to cover as much of their range as for a species with small ranges. If we calculate these targets for the endemics, for most species, the current protected area coverage is not actually adequate, given their small range size. Most of these species reaching their targets are near threatened and least concerned species, which tend to be those with larger range sizes. But if we can't expand our formal protected areas to provide sufficient coverage for endemic birds because of the limits of state lands, what else can we do? This is especially important given the threat of climate change, which means we may need to consider the ability of our protected areas to support species under future conditions, such as the ranges of many species or their habitats may shift, such as at high elevations. Now, whatever new protected area target is decided, we still need to consider that more than 80% or so of the land falls outside of formal protection. As we've seen, the challenges of maintaining protected areas in Grenada and Trinidad and Tobago, of ensuring climate resilient landscapes and managing species for which we know very little means we can't fully protect these endemic species without taking a whole landscape approach to conservation. Currently, there's a lot of focus on a recent new designation formalized by the Convention on Biological Diversity called Other Effective Area-Based Conservation Measures, or OECMs. This can be thought of as an umbrella for other managed areas that benefit biodiversity, such as indigenous lands, watershed management areas, or restricted areas. OECMs have not yet been officially formalized in the Caribbean, but they offer a potential solution for recognizing the conservation benefits of many areas in the Caribbean that don't fall within formal protected areas. What's a really positive step in the right direction is that half of all Caribbean National Biodiversity Action Plans identify private land management as a priority. There are real opportunities for incentivizing private conservation, and we found that there was a real support for this among stakeholders during our protected areas consultations in Tobago, for instance. Some ways to develop public-private partnerships that are still underutilized in the Caribbean are developing payments for ecosystem services or agri-environmental partnerships. What is central to the success of promoting such approaches at a broad scale is having strong leadership and governance that is committed to making these approaches economically viable. But governance alone won't lead to successful buy-in of stakeholders. Endemic bird conservation programs that have been successful to date in the Caribbean are deeply rooted in the cultural importance of the birds, engaging stakeholders by recognizing and drawing on the local narratives about birds and their habitats. One early model that was extremely successful at this was the Rare Pride program for some of the region's most iconic endemic parrots. We're able to engage local communities by using marketing methods in a way not done before in conservation, to connect with the birds and highlight their value to the collective national heritage. There are many other local success stories that work across the spectrum of protected areas and private lands, many supported by an organization that we work closely with, Birds Caribbean. We've highlighted just a few here: the control of invasive species in Antigua and offshore islands, community management planning in Jamaica, community education in Hispaniola, sustainable tourism developed by the Caribbean Birding Trail, and awareness generated by the Endemic Bird Festival. These projects use locally appropriate interventions that work to the benefit of all those who share the landscape. They are successful because they are truly participatory, engage local decision makers, and have invested in developing long-term partnerships and integrating local knowledge. They demonstrate that even small investments can have huge, big benefits for the conservation of endemic birds, as well as the habitats and communities that live alongside them. So, what are our final lessons? The Caribbean presents unique challenges to understanding and conserving endemic birds. We recognize that increasing formal protection on many islands is unrealistic, but that the Caribbean has an opportunity to lead the way with the renegotiation of the Aichi targets to reconceptualize how we achieve landscape conservation. The success of local projects demonstrates the opportunity to promote a sense of ownership of the Caribbean's cultural and natural heritage, as well as conserve the full suite of endemic birds necessary for maintaining ecosystem functioning and landscape resiliency. Finally, we hope that a silver lining of the COVID pandemic is an opportunity for the Caribbean to reflect on its relationship with nature and build the capacity necessary to adapt to a changing climate. We want to close by thanking the Society for this opportunity to share our ideas on bird conservation in the Caribbean. And we want to thank our colleagues in the Forest Department of the Government of Grenada, the Environmental Policy and Planning Division of the Trinidad and Tobago Government, the FAO's Caribbean Sub-Office, and the Linnean Society for funding, and Birds Caribbean for their continuing support. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ellie and Howard, for an absolutely fascinating talk. I'm never going to think about Caribbean birds as being James Bond ever again. Never.
Thanks very much.
All those wonderful community ways that you highlighted. We've got a few questions, but I'm going to be really horrible chair and ask my one first. I was really interested, Ellie, that you talked about dry forests as being particularly at threat. And that's certainly true from the point of view of plants, as people tend to think of dry forests as useless land. So what's the proportion in that kind of, in the graph you showed, Howard, about the kind of proportion of protected areas? Is that sort of mostly cloud forest type habitats, or how is dry forest represented in that?
Most of the coverage, so there are more birds, more endemics found at the higher elevations, but the ones, the forests tend to have the least coverage. So the moist forest, but also the dry forest. So I think from other stuff that we didn't present, the dry forests are the second least covered set of birds in protected areas.
Yeah.
And that goes the same for protected area coverage in general.
Yeah, definitely. For the islands that we've worked on, definitely dry forest systems tend to be underrepresented given their relative proportion on the islands, because because the islands are basically mountaintops coming out of the ocean. Usually the dry forests are in a ring around the lower bits of the islands, and those are the places that then tend to get the most amount of development pressure.
Great. So Andrew Dobson has asked a question. People are putting questions. Please, can people put questions into the Q&A box, because it's really hard to keep track of them when they're in the when they're in the chat. Andrew Dobson has asked a question about whether there's any translocations plans for any individual species in view of climate change.
Hi, Andrew. I don't know of any. I think most of the translocation plans that or discussion around translocation revolves around moving endemics to offshore islands because of the threat of invasive predators. But I don't know of any. Do you know of any specifically for climate change?
Not really specifically for climate change. Again, a lot of the focus, a lot of the real interventions have been to deal with alien invasive predators. And I haven't really seen very much work yet, not on the ground, in terms of the translocation project specifically to address climate.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think generally there isn't that much work done on climate change on birds in the Caribbean, or on species, endemics in general, because the data, the climate data, are so difficult to downscale to the size of the islands because they're so small. So it's really difficult to kind of make these projections on species populations because of the climate data.
Well, also the kind of topographic,
the
steep topographic bits on the islands. It makes
Absolutely, it's so coarse scale. The current projections and current models are so coarse.
And as you said, there's so much topographic change in such a small region.
Yeah. Liz Andrew has put in the chat that she says, can we share a rather dramatic and urgent threat to the cockpit country in northwest Jamaica from new bauxite mining as of last night?
Yeah, wow. Yeah. We've definitely seen that there's a lot of that, and certainly for a lot of the islands that depend on tourism, the COVID crisis definitely has highlighted how fragile that reliance is on international travel. And certainly one of the big worries for folks that rely on ecotourism to support their conservation actions, again, the reliance on a single form of income like ecotourism really highlights a fragility in terms of management approach to conservation.
Yeah, and just as a plug for Birds Caribbean, I'd say if you aren't aware of and you're interested, to go and look at their blog, because they do promote a lot of advocacy on a lot of these development issues in the Caribbean. So.
Great. So that kind of addresses the next question, which I was going to ask you, is how can we engage the key politicians to help them understand that they can both help conservation efforts and local communities? And it sounds like that's definitely one way, but how about others?
Yeah, definitely. So the answer to that question is really to get to know the people that represent you. If you're a local person, if you live in the Caribbean, one of the great benefits of living in the Caribbean is that the islands are really small communities and people get to know each other. And most people have relationships that do allow them to interact with many more decision makers than would ordinarily take place in a place like the UK, where we currently are. So in terms of doing this, I think the key thing is to find allies across the political spectrum, and to make sure that when you take that message of conservation, so you want to get the politicians more interested in conservation of a particular species or a particular habitat, is to find allies within the political community, people that either are from those areas or represent those areas and have a stake in the conservation of those sites, and starting a conversation with them. And that conversation could start off by inviting them out to one of these sites to actually see these species or see these habitats. Because for a lot of people, they don't really get to, a lot of politicians are busy people. They probably have never engaged with the habitats or the birds in the way that we generally get to do. And so, by engaging them in that way, it allows us to, to make it personal for them. So if you're a local Caribbean person, that's the way to do it. I think if you're an external person, definitely, for instance, I spent a lot of my career in the US, for instance, getting, again, political representation in the US interested, or here in the UK interested in conservation in the region, is really important. For instance, here in the UK, we've got the Darwin Initiative, and it is our biggest mechanism for doing conservation globally and funding conservation globally, and to encourage the politicians that represent us here in the UK to take an interest in the running of Darwin, and the funding of Darwin is a key mechanism for supporting conservation in the Caribbean. And similarly in the US, there's many ways that people can get in touch with their local representatives to say, hey, the funding of the migratory bird programs, the funding of conservation projects being run by the Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Forest Service, for instance, that deal with migratory species and conservation of endangered species is really key. And by having that conversation, you can have a big impact on conservation.
Yeah. Okay, so Joseph Wonderly has asked, how much planning for extreme weather events, stronger hurricanes and extreme droughts? Is there anything about that? How much is predicted? Or it's really hard to predict all of that stuff, but is there planning around those kinds of extreme weather events?
Well, Sandy, I think it's great that Joe is asking that, because it's funny. Joe is, to me, the expert on Caribbean birds and their responses to hurricanes. I think the key thing that we've seen is that the data suggests that hurricanes are becoming more intense. They're becoming more frequent, and so these birds that they've evolved to basically cope with a given tempo of disturbance in the region. By us causing the climate to go haywire, it means that in the short term we've got to find a way to protect these birds in situ. Whatever conservation we can do to reduce the pressure on them, whether it's the other pressures, because probably we're not going to be able to reduce the intensity of hurricanes or their tempo. Yeah, but what we can do is we can do as much as possible to protect their habitats, to reduce the impact of alien invasives, to reduce the other kinds of human pressures on them in their habitats, would be the things that we could do.
I think there is no easy answer to it. I think I've been involved with some of the IPC the next assessment. And I'd say that there is a lot of discussion about how do we protect these landscapes in a a whole landscape way, and as a making them as climate resilient as we can. So it's being discussed, and islands haven't always been so in the forefront as we'd like them to be. And I think there's now more focus on islands and how we can actually make them more climate resilient. So there's no easy answer yet. But,
well, it's good. It's good they're coming up. That's good they're coming up on people's radar. There's a couple of questions here, one from Josh Noseworthy and another one from Chris DeRook, which I'm going to kind of pull together. Okay. Josh asks about private land trusts. Could those play a greater role? And then Chris asks about, and this is they're kind of the same, but they're sort of different, about how traditional small scale farming creates really high biodiversity value landscapes. So maybe just address those two things.
Sure. Definitely, I think to begin with, for instance, if I talk about Grenada, I think in Grenada, the state only owns about 20% of the land on the island, and the rest of it is all private. So there's a central role for private ownership in conservation. And yes, of course, there is, if we try to do management of private properties in a way that's friendly to our endemic species, then of course we're going to have a much bigger impact than, say, if we did the best conservation in our current protected areas, just by the pure size of the amount of private properties. So there is a role to play. The challenge is in doing private conservation to make sure that that conservation is consistent with what are the local mores for the way that local people interact with land, because land ownership is a complicated thing in the Caribbean. In some of the islands that we work in, there's this thing that people talk about. They call it family lands, where the ownership of land is shared by families, and there's not a formal transfer of ownership. And there's a lot of historical use of spaces. So if you're somebody from the outside trying to influence conservation, you have to be really sensitive to issues of access and ownership in the islands. So it's really complex. I mean, not simply a case of just buying up land and setting it aside for conservation. It really is a case of trying to negotiate with local people about how they perceive management.
Yeah, I think I just add to that from the sort of ecological side of the endemic birds. There's always going to be some birds that really need really the least disturbed habitat of whatever habitat type they prefer. So you're always going to have some land set aside, whether it's private land or protected areas, that is as least disturbed as it can be. And I guess then what needs to happen is we need to then think about how do we connect these pieces of land, how do we connect them with corridors, and that's again where private lands can come into play as well. So
definitely.
Certainly,
This is why, you know, we're really advocating for this kind of joined up thinking of each island as a whole landscape, you know, not just patches of montane forest or patches of sub-montane forest or patches of dry forest in a matrix of private lands or human dominated landscape. What we would love to see, and that would help us make these systems more climate resilient, is that the whole landscape is managed for nature. That's the way that we can do this. And, you know, obviously nature provides all these services to us. So this is not a win-lose situation. You know, there's an opportunity here for people to really get benefits out of nature.
Yeah, I like the fact that you talked about people, because I always think about people as being part of nature. So that kind of makes sense if we're managing the whole landscape. That leads kind of into the next question, which is about people. And Jeff Wells has made the connection between migratory birds, citizens of places like the United States, and how do you feel about a focus on educating populations in those areas of the US, for example, where the Caribbean birds are migrating? Is that a way to kind of help this?
Yeah, I think that happens quite a lot already. I think a lot of the research that's been done on endemic birds in the Caribbean has stemmed from work that's been done on migratory birds. I think a lot of the US funding for migratory birds is how we've done endemic bird research. And I think there is a push to, again, like Environment for the Americas, some of those organizations that really focus on educating people about the whole kind of flyaway life cycle of a bird. So definitely.
I think. And money spent on education and talking to people about these birds, and a lot of these species, you know, move all through, you know, the region. To think of the region not just as, you know, these tiny islands separated from America, separated from Central America, separated from South America. They're all a joined up system as far as the birds are concerned. And we need to educate people so that they all, you know, all the different people in the ranges where the birds occur, understand that they're a shared resource. The birds are shared between all of us in the region.
I always like to think of conservation as being basically dependent upon conversation.
Yeah,
kind
absolutely.
of the same word, and you can always mistype them, so they're actually the same thing.
Yeah.
So somebody else, Liz Andrew, has asked a couple of different questions. I'll do her first one first. So she asks about mangroves, and mangroves are another one of those kind of things like dry forests. Has there been any success in helping with mangroves? She's saying there's little success on that in Jamaica from Kennedy and Liz.
Yeah, mangroves are hard, you know, because again, you know, most of the development that we see tends to be coastal development in the islands. Everybody wants to build a hotel right next to a beach or next to the coast, or plan their latest marina development where the mangroves are, and then dredge those mangroves and put their marina or boardwalk or whatever where these mangrove systems are. And they're such important systems, you know, in terms of offshore productivity, in terms of protection of beaches. There's just so much that they do for us, and it's really difficult to convince the political directorate in these countries that actually these systems provide more. They provide more resources than simply, you know, if you were to replace them with a hotel development.
Yeah, I think that, and mangroves are also often seen to be botanical deserts as well, but actually they're super interesting.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that, you know, all these kind of habitats that everyone thinks are boring actually turned out to be the most interesting ones. So there's a question here from Hannah Madden about effective protected area management given the lack of funding and local capacity. And I think, I'm sure you have ideas on that, but it's one of those things that's can't answer. So I feel a bit unfair asking it, but I'm sure.
Go on, Ellie.
I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think so. SIDS, we have a problem. We have limited capacity, but I think one of the great benefits of living and working in the Caribbean is maybe as individual countries we lack the capacity, but as a region there's a lot of talent within the Caribbean. One of the big challenges for the Caribbean, I think, is that there a lot of times we tend to think of these individual countries and there's the folks working on them as only working in that one country. But actually, if we shared those resources across the islands, then actually we have a big pool of people to call on and the opportunity to share a lot of experiences. And this is where, you know, working across the region through organizations like Birds Caribbean and other regional organizations that allow for sharing of knowledge, tech transfer between the islands is really critically important, because the most expensive resource to develop is the human resource.
Absolutely.
And so by us being able to do that, that's where we make the biggest gains.
Maybe this is a positive of COVID, because travel between the islands and the Caribbean is so super expensive, that maybe now that we're all much more used to talking on Zoom and online stuff is less of a barrier than it was before, that we can do some of that sharing much more easily now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe
that's a really positive way to end. And I just want to thank you both for an absolutely fascinating lecture. And it's given me great hope for birds in the Caribbean. And I think it's such a fascinating area, and the pictures are beautiful. And thank you so much for sharing all those thoughts with us. And I hope you can get back in the field soon.
It was our pleasure.
Yeah.
And also thanks to everyone who's come along today. And the Linnean Society is a society which is for everybody. So it's not just for academics, it's for people who love nature and are interested in seeing nature thrive. So please do, if you're interested, contact us about becoming a fellow of the society. We'd really like you to join. And that would be absolutely fantastic. And thank you again, Ellie and Howard, for a great talk. Thanks a lot.
Thank you
so much. Great day, everyone.